My phone buzzed at midnight. The bank app said, available balance, 0. My son Ethan Hart was in Rome, laughing in designer suits, drinking wine on my life savings. $80,000, gone in one night. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I smiled. Because 3 days later, that same son called me, voice shaking, breath breaking. Mom, what did you do? And I said, sweetheart, I just stopped what you were taking. The notification came at midnight. A soft chime that sounded harmless, like the whisper of an angel. I looked down at my phone, eyes half open, and saw the words that would change everything. Available balance, dollars. For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe the system glitched. Maybe I clicked the wrong account. But I refreshed it once, twice, 3 times, and that number, that cruel little 0, just sat there on the screen, still and absolute. $80,000. 30 years of cleaning houses, scrubbing floors, ironing shirts until my fingers cracked. Gone in one night. And I didn't have to wonder where it went. I knew. I didn't even need to call the bank to see the name written across the transaction. I could feel it in my bones. Ethan. My son. By morning, the confirmation came through. Multiple wire transfers, all authorized, all clean. Recipient, Ethan Hart. I called the bank anyway. The woman on the other end had a soft, rehearsed voice. Would you like to file a fraud report, Mrs. Hart? I almost laughed. Fraud? Fraud is what strangers do to you, not your own blood. The moment I hung up, the landline rang. Evelyn? It's Mrs. Miller from next door. Honey, did you see Ethan's Instagram? They're in Rome. Lord, the view, the food, the suits, they look like royalty. Rome. Of course, Rome. I opened my old phone, the one I keep just for photos, and found his page. There he was, my son. My pride, my blood, my good boy. Standing under the Roman sky, wine glass raised, smiling like the world was his. Beside him, his beautiful wife, Chloe Reed, her diamond earrings catching the sunlight like they were mocking me. Behind them stood her mother, Victoria, lips sharp as her pearls, posture screaming power. The caption said, Rome, my new beginning, I deserve this. And right below it, Chloe had commented, thanks for everything, mom-in-law. That little money bag emoji burned straight through me. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't cry. I just stood there in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, staring at the screen until my reflection blurred. What I felt wasn't anger, not yet. It was something quieter. A stillness that came when your heart finally stopped pretending to be surprised. On the counter above me were framed photos. Ethan with ice cream smeared on his face, Ethan in his first suit, Ethan on graduation day. Every smile paid for with the skin of my hands and the ache of my back. I sold my wedding ring to pay his tuition. I sold my little piece of land in Georgia to buy him books. I cleaned kitchens in Brentwood in the morning, bathrooms in Beverly Hills at night, just so that boy could grow up believing the world was kind. Last week, I took a tray of fried chicken and collard greens to his place in Studio City. The doorman, polite but nervous, told me, Mrs. Hart, they ask that you don't come up without notice. So I sat on the bench outside for 2 hours, holding that tray like it was a prayer I wasn't allowed to say. When the heat started to sting behind my eyes, I stood up and walked home. Didn't take the bus, didn't call a cab, just walked. By the time I got back, the chicken was cold and I was empty. That night, Mrs. Miller brought over a pie. You've always been strong, Evelyn, she said. Boys come around, you'll see. I smiled, but I didn't believe her. I'd stopped believing in that kind of miracle a long time ago. When she left, I went to my bedroom and pulled an old shoebox from under the bed. Inside was a red leather notebook, my little secret companion through all these years. It held recipes, bills, prayers, and pieces of me no one ever saw. I opened it to a clean page and wrote just one line. My son didn't die today, but the mother inside me did. The next morning, I took the bus downtown and went to see Thomas Gray, the first man I ever loved. Now a lawyer with silver hair and the kind of eyes that can still read between the lines of a woman's silence. Evelyn Hart, he said, smiling softly. It's been a while. Too long, I replied, setting a folder of bank papers on his desk. Tell me if I signed something I don't remember. He went through the papers in silence, his jaw tightening more with each page. Finally, he looked up. Joint account authorization, he said quietly. And this, he tapped a page with my name, this isn't your signature. I stared at it. It looked like mine, but it wasn't. My hand would never curve that way. He asked if I wanted to press charges. I thought of Ethan's smile in Rome, Chloe's diamond grin, Victoria's high-boned smirk. I thought of the nights I'd scrubbed other people's floors while he slept under clean sheets. "I want my name back," I said, "and I want it in writing." Thomas nodded. "Then we start here. Elder financial abuse. We can request an emergency freeze. It'll be ugly." I almost laughed. It's already ugly. When I left his office, the sun was too bright, the world too loud. I walked past a clinic on Vermont Avenue, the one I'd been avoiding for months, and decided to stop in. Dr. Samuel Harris greeted me with that calm kindness doctors keep for people they know they can't save. After the blood tests, he sat me down. "It's leukemia, Evelyn. Advanced." He waited for me to react. "How long?" I asked. "Months. Maybe less. Treatment could help, but it'll take your strength and your time." I nodded slowly. "Then no, I'm not spending what's left of me hooked to tubes. I've spent my whole life fighting to live. I won't spend the rest of it learning how to die." He didn't argue. He just pressed my hand, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. When I got home, I put on the kettle. The whistle filled the kitchen, steady, high, familiar. I opened my red notebook again and wrote a second line beneath the first. "This isn't revenge, this is justice. Justice lets me die in peace." That night, I slept through till morning for the first time in years. Across the ocean, my son was raising a glass to the Roman sky. His wife was laughing. His mother-in-law was posing, and none of them knew what was already coming for them. 3 days later, the phone rang. I didn't need to look to know the number. I knew his voice before he spoke. "Mom?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. "Mom, what did you do? They froze everything. I can't access a single dollar. Chloe's furious, Victoria's gone." "What did you do?" I wiped my hands on a clean dish towel, looked out the window at the orange Los Angeles sunset, and smiled. That slow, quiet kind of smile that only comes when pain finally turns into peace. "Baby," I said softly, "I just stopped what you were taking." The morning after Ethan's call, the sun rose like it didn't care. Light spilled across my kitchen floor, touching the same cracked tiles I'd been stepping on for 20 years. The world kept turning. Coffee kept brewing, and somewhere across the ocean my son was learning what silence really feels like. I didn't rush to pick up the phone again. I didn't even listen to the voicemail he left that night. I let it sit there, like a wound I didn't need to reopen. Instead, I made coffee, black, no sugar, and watched the steam twist in the air. The kettle's hiss filled the house, and for a moment, that sound felt holy. I'd spent my whole life answering to everyone else. Bosses, bills, teachers, doctors, my son. But that morning, for the first time in years, I didn't owe anybody an answer. After breakfast, I walked to Thomas Gray's office. He was already waiting, 2 cups of coffee on his desk, one black, one with milk, like he somehow remembered after all these years. He didn't ask how I was doing. Men like him knew that kind of question doesn't have an honest answer. He handed me a folder. "The freeze went through," he said. "The IRS has flagged every account under Ethan's name. Interpol has been notified about the transfers overseas." I nodded, quiet. "So, he knows." "Oh, he knows," Thomas said with a faint smirk. "But that's not the end. The women, Chloe and Victoria, they moved part of the money into shell accounts. The trail's messy, but it's there." I stared out the window. Downtown Los Angeles shimmered in the morning haze, pretending to be golden. "Then we'll follow it," I said. Thomas looked at me like a man who'd forgotten how much strength a woman could carry. "Evelyn," he said softly, "you don't have to see this through. You can let me handle it." I smiled. "Thomas, I'm dying. The least I can do is live long enough to finish what I started." He didn't argue. Instead, he opened his drawer and slid a pen toward me. "Sign here," he said. "This makes me your legal representative." My hand trembled as I signed, but my voice didn't. "Do it," I said. "Burn the lies down to the paper they're written on." When I stepped outside, the city greeted me with heat, the kind that smells like asphalt and survival. I took the bus home, sat by the window, and watched faces pass. Tired women, hungry men, children dreaming of better places. They didn't know it, but I envied them. They still had time. At home, I opened my red notebook. On the next page, I wrote, "Day 1 after the fire." And beneath it, "Justice isn't loud, it waits." That became my ritual. Every morning, I woke before sunrise. I cleaned the house, even when it didn't need cleaning. I folded the same dish towel over and over, boiled the same kettle, wrote the same date. The silence of my little home became something alive, something heavy but familiar, like a loyal dog that had finally stopped barking. A week later, I went to visit Margaret Lee, my neighbor 2 blocks down. She used to be an accountant before retirement. Sharp eyes behind thick glasses, mind like a filing cabinet that never forgot. When I told her what happened, she didn't gasp. She just nodded, like she'd already seen the whole movie. "Sit down," she said, pulling her chair closer to the computer. "Let's see what we can find." She showed me how to navigate the bank's online portal, every withdrawal, every transfer. "You see this?" she said, pointing at a date. "That's a cash withdrawal for $3,000. Says car repairs. You make any repairs lately?" "No." She clicked again. "June 19th, $2,500. Insurance fees?" "No." Her eyes flicked up to mine. "Then it's him. All of it." We spent hours printing statements, marking each with different colored pens, blue for bank charges, red for Ethan, black for unknown. By the time we finished, my hands ached, but my heart felt strangely light. Every line I traced was a confession he didn't know he'd written. That night, I added it all to my red notebook. Each page looked like scripture now, sacred, honest, painful. I didn't cry, I didn't curse his name, I just kept writing. Because words, unlike people, don't lie when you bleed on them. 2 weeks later, Thomas called. "They tried to re-register your house deed," he said. "Joint ownership, your name and Ethan's." My stomach twisted. "They tried to take my home?" "Looks like it. The county clerk flagged the signature mismatch so it didn't go through. But if it had..." I didn't let him finish. "Then let's make sure it never happens again." For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then Thomas said quietly, "You know, Evelyn, I've handled plenty of cases like this. But you," he paused, almost afraid to finish, "you're different. You don't want revenge, do you?" "No," I said. "I want peace. But peace has a price, and I intend to pay it." That night I wrote again. Peace isn't gentle, it's earned. Outside, the city hummed like a tired heart. I went to bed with the window open, listening to the sound of cars rushing nowhere. Somewhere out there, my son was probably doing the same, only his silence would have sounded different. Hollow, heavy, hungry. Days turned into weeks. My body began to weaken. The doctor's words lingered in the back of my head, a clock ticking louder with every sunrise. Some mornings I couldn't even lift the kettle. But I still tried, because giving up would have felt like dying twice. Then, one afternoon, Thomas showed up at my door with papers in his hand. "We've got enough evidence to open a federal case," he said. "Elder financial abuse, forgery, conspiracy. It'll take time, but the system's moving." I leaned against the doorframe, too tired to stand straight. "Good," I whispered. He studied me for a long moment. "You don't look well." "I'm not," I said, "but I'm still standing." After you left, I made myself a cup of tea, but my hands shook so badly I spilled half of it on the counter. I watched the tea run down the edge and drip to the floor. Something about that image, brown liquid tracing its way through cracks, made me think of time. How it always finds the weakest places to escape. Across the ocean, in Rome, Ethan's world began to crumble. I didn't know it yet, but while I was counting the drips on my kitchen counter, he was sitting in a restaurant near Piazza Navona, watching his credit card get declined. Once, twice, 3 times. He called the waiter. Tried another, same result. Chloe's eyes rolled, sharp and bored. "Seriously, Ethan? Are you broke already?" He forced a laugh. "It must be a mistake. I'll call the bank." But the voice on the other end said what he already feared. "This account has been frozen due to suspicious activity." He hung up, face pale, hands shaking. "Frozen?" Chloe hissed. "What did you do?" Before he could answer, Victoria leaned back in her chair, that wicked calm smile curling at the corner of her mouth. "Don't look at me like that, darling. I told you not to mix business with sentiment." "Don't talk about my mother," Ethan snapped. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, sipping her wine. "She's probably dead by now. Let it go." I like to think that was the first time he really saw them, those women he thought were family. Predators dressed in silk. Later that night, while they argued in their hotel suite, Ethan sat alone on the balcony, staring at the city that no longer felt like paradise. The laughter behind him turned to whispers, and then to a door slamming shut. When he finally picked up his phone, he called me again. I let it ring out. Then I unplugged the landline. The next morning, I went back to Margaret's. She was in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. "You're famous," she said, tapping a headline. "They froze a luxury account linked to Los Angeles. Sounds like your boy made the news." I smiled faintly. "Then justice is on schedule." Together, we filled out the last batch of paperwork for the Elder Protection Office. The clerk barely looked at us when we dropped it off, just stamped the forms and said, "You'll get a response in 2 weeks." 2 weeks. I didn't know if I had that long, but I nodded anyway. Back home, I sat at my table, hands trembling as I wrote, "If justice comes too late, I'll wait at the door." That night, I dreamed of Ethan as a boy again, running through sprinklers in the summer, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. I woke up crying, though I didn't realize it until I tasted salt on my lips. Days passed. My hair began to fall out in soft, thin strands. I tied it up in a scarf and kept moving. One evening, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face looked different, hollowed, older, honest. I grabbed a pair of scissors and started cutting. Locks of dark hair fell into the sink like dead leaves. When I finished, I looked at myself and whispered, "For once, I look exactly how I feel." Then I took a piece of chalk and wrote on the mirror, "No one destroys me twice." It became my armor. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Ethan's spiral only deepened. Chloe had left him. Victoria disappeared, taking whatever money was left. His so-called friends stopped returning calls. The glamorous life he'd built turned to dust. He tried to contact me again, emails, calls, messages, but I ignored them all. My silence was my lesson. One evening, as I sat at my kitchen table writing, Thomas called. "The investigation's expanding," he said. "Interpol's pressing charges against Chloe and Victoria for fraud. Ethan's still being questioned." I closed my notebook. "Let them face what they built," he hesitated. "And you, what will you face?" I looked at the candle flickering beside me, the wax melting slow and steady. "Peace," I said, "and maybe the end." The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds outside my window. Strange, because I hadn't heard them in weeks. The light through the curtains was soft, almost merciful. I made tea, turned on the radio, and for the first time in months hummed along to an old song. By afternoon, the phone rang again. I knew it was him before I even picked up. "Mom?" Ethan's voice cracked like a child's. "Mom, I don't know what to do. They're saying I could go to jail. Chloe's gone. Victoria too. I'm alone. Please, help me." I let the silence stretch until I could hear his breathing, shaky, panicked, real. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I didn't take anything from you. I just stopped what you were taking from me." "Please," he whispered. "You said you'd always be there for me." "I was," I said, my throat dry but steady, "until you stopped being there for yourself." He sobbed. "I can't fix this." "Then learn," I said, and I hung up. After the call, I sat in the quiet, the red notebook open in front of me. I wrote my last entry of the day. He called again. "The lesson has begun. Sometimes love must hurt to be understood." Outside, the sun dipped below the skyline, and my reflection in the window looked almost peaceful. For the first time in a long, long while, I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was free. Flows as one continuous audiobook-ready narrative. The days after that call moved like slow water, the kind that finds every crack and fills it without a sound. Morning light kept arriving on time, laying itself across my kitchen table as if nothing in the world had changed. I kept my ritual, because ritual is what keeps a woman standing when storms have no wind left in them. Boil the kettle, fold the dish towel, write a line in the red notebook that told the truth no one else could say for me. Thomas stopped by with updates I could feel before he spoke. He sat at the table like he used to sit on the hood of his first car, casual, careful not to scare me off. "Evelyn," he said, tapping a manila folder as if it might float away, "the freeze is holding. Interpol has begun formal action against Chloe and Victoria. Paper trails have teeth, after all." I took the folder without opening it. Paper stopped meaning much when my own body became a document I could no longer edit. "And Ethan?" I asked. "He isn't charged," Thomas said, "but he's stranded. Passport flagged. Accounts frozen. The women who pushed him here, well, they won't have room to run for long." I let the words sit. Stranded, frozen. Words that once sounded like punishment now sounded like a pause button God had finally found. "Good," I said. Not with glee, but with a relief so small it could hide in a teardrop. Let the noise stop long enough for him to hear himself. Thomas studied me for a while, like a man committing the last light of summer to memory. He cleared his throat. "Are you sleeping?" Like iron, I said. I think justice is a mattress I should have bought sooner. He almost smiled. You always find a way to make hard things gentle. No, I said. I find a way to make them quiet. That afternoon, the weakness came with the ease of a guest who no longer needed to knock. It arrived at my elbows when I tried to lift the kettle. It arrived in my knees when I stood too long by the sink. I let it in. There was no point pretending I didn't know its name. When the water finally sang, I cupped the mug with both hands and felt the heat like proof that something in me still moved. I wrote, "Peace is heavy until you pick it up." Margaret Lee stopped by with a plastic folder and a dozen small kindnesses nobody else would think to bring. Elastic bands for the loose pages, a pack of highlighters, a little bag of jasmine tea. "You'll like this one," she said, tapping the folder. "Someone tried to refile your deed again. They used your old address for verification. Whoever did it hasn't learned that the county clerk isn't asleep." "Victoria," I said. Margaret nodded. "Or someone who taught her to wink at rules." We laughed the way tired women laugh, without moving our shoulders, just enough to rattle the air. She made tea in my kitchen like it was hers, and told me stories about the old office where she used to work. "Numbers," she said, "are honest, even when people aren't." I thought about the numbers in my account, the zero that had taken everything and given me back my breath. Honest, yes. Brutal too. That night, the city turned its usual gold before falling into its usual darkness. I pulled the chalk from the bathroom windowsill and traced over the words on the mirror where my breath had tried to erase them. No one destroys me twice. Then I undid my scarf and let my hair, the new brief, clean version of it, meet the air. My head felt light and true, like I had emptied it of anything that didn't belong to me. Days ran together the way a hymn runs after the first verse. Same tune, deeper meaning. Some mornings I felt strong enough to sweep the porch. Some I only watched the dust and decided it could live another day. Mrs. Miller came by with soup I could swallow on the days my throat remembered to be kind. She talked about the neighbor's dog and the price of peaches, and how the radio station changed its afternoon host. God bless women who know how to keep you in the world with nonsense. On a Tuesday that smelled like rain that never came, the doorbell rang. I opened it halfway, the chain still on, because grief had left me careful. The hallway beyond the screen seemed longer than usual. 2 heartbeats later, I did what you do when your past returns wearing yesterday's eyes. I took off the chain. "Mom," Ethan said. The word came through like he wasn't sure he had the right to use it anymore. He was thinner. The arrogance that once wore his jaw like a crown had slipped to the floor and shattered. He didn't bother trying to pick it up. He wasn't dressed like Rome. He was dressed like a boy who had learned that shame is a fabric that doesn't stretch. One small suitcase hung from his hand like a quiet confession. "You look hungry," I said, because that is the sentence that rights 1,000 wrongs. He nodded. "I haven't eaten since Madrid." "Then sit." I didn't hug him. I didn't touch his face, searching for my baby in the bones of a man. I gave him a bowl and a spoon and quiet. Quiet is the closest thing to forgiveness that doesn't lie. He ate the way a person reads instructions to come back to life. Spoon by spoon. Breath by breath. When he finished, he put the bowl on the counter, like it was expensive. "I thought you'd slam the door," he said. "I thought so too," I said. "But this door's older than both of us. It's seen worse." He tried to speak again, and I let my hand rise palm first like a crossing guard stopping traffic. "Not tonight," I said gently. "Give me one meal without excuses." He nodded and went still. I pulled a spare sheet from the closet and made the couch in the living room with the care you give to a guest whose sins have your last name. I found an old quilt, the one my aunt sewed from church dress leftovers, and laid it over him. I stood for a moment in the doorway and watched him sleep with his forearm over his face, like a man trying to hide from mourning. In the old movies, next comes a flood. In real life, it comes in cups. The morning after, I woke to the clink of dishes. He was washing them, slow, careful, as if porcelain could judge him. "Morning," he said without turning, and his voice held a tiny hope that the word might be true. "Didn't think you remembered how," I said. "Guess some lessons stick." He dried a plate and set it on the rack like a fragile truth. We had coffee, his with sugar, mine not. The air between us tried to grow words. I let it try. When he finally spoke, it was not a defense. Chloe's gone, he said. Victoria too. I know. He looked up surprised. You know? Thomas told me. I let a small smile show itself, the human kind, not the kind you wear like armor. I let them go. Some lessons don't arrive until everything else leaves. He swallowed. The shame rose in him like weather. You should hate me. I did, I said. For a few days, it was heavier than the kettle. I sipped. I put it down. I don't know how to fix this, he said, voice getting smaller as if trying to fit back into the boy he used to be. Then don't fix it, I said. Live better. That's how you repay the dead. The sentence arrived in the room before he understood it. A tremor crossed his face. He looked at my scarf, at the thinness in my cheeks, and something like fear built a home behind his eyes. Mom, don't talk like that. The doctor did, I said, not cruelly. Truth is kind or it isn't truth. Months, he said. We're spending them. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Then let me do something. You can carry the groceries at least, I said. And fix the back fence. I smiled so he would know I was teasing and not, yet, assigning penance. He stayed. Pride has a weak heart. It can't survive on my porch. He mowed the small yard without being asked, replaced the sagging hinge on the gate that oiled the squeal out of the front door so the house could breathe without complaining. He repaired the old record player with instructions from the internet and a patience I hadn't seen since he was 11, bent over a model airplane, tongue out, eyes narrowed to the task. In the evenings, we sat outside. I took the rocker. He sat on the steps. Sometimes we talked about small things, the weather, the couple who argued on Thursdays, the dog that refused to heal. Sometimes we let silence do what words couldn't. Silence, once a weapon, became a chair we pulled up between us. On the second Sunday, he came home with a small box wrapped in brown paper. He placed it on the table as if it might break the wood. I found it near Melrose, he said. At a pawn shop. Took me 3 tries to convince the man it was mine to buy back. I opened it. The ring lay there like a memory that finally wrote itself an ending. My engagement ring. The one I sold for his books the year Hope and Hunger were the same animal. You didn't have to, I said. The words came out thick. I wanted to, he said. It cost me the last good thing I owned. You bought back a memory, I said. That's worth more than gold. He learned to sit with that kind of sentence. He stopped trying to turn it into a moral or an apology. He let it be what it was, a blessing wrapped around a bruise. Thomas came by with final paperwork. He and Ethan shook hands like men building a bridge. The deed is secure, Thomas said, placing an envelope in my palm. Your name's back where it belongs. We drank sweet tea on the porch. Thomas told a story about a judge who had once fallen asleep in court and woken up just in time to say sustained to the right question. He watched me while pretending not to, eyes flicking to my wrists, to the thinnest there. When he left, he didn't say goodbye, not really. Men like him never say goodbye until the ground makes them. At night, the pain grew accurate. It knew my bones by first name now. I moved slower and learned not to argue with chairs when they offered themselves. I wrote fewer words, but the ones I wrote came out clear as bells. If tomorrow doesn't come, today was enough. Sometimes I copied that line again, just to convince my hands it was true. One evening, after a day that took more from me than I could pretend to give, I asked for tea. Ethan lifted the kettle the way a man lifts his sleeping child, careful not to spill what is holy. The whistle rose. I smiled at the sound. Let it sing, I said. He turned and saw the way my hands lay, open and easy. He must have known then, the way children know when the story is about to end and try not to blink so they won't miss the last line. He brought the cup to the table and sat with me. I wrapped my fingers around the heat and took one sip. A whole summer lived in that swallow. I breathed it in, set the cup down, and felt the room do that slow kind of widening that comes before a door opens. I'm not afraid, I said, mostly to the air. I just don't want you to be either. He shook his head. Don't, he said. Please don't. I reached across the table and laid my hand over his. You came home, I said. That's the only miracle I ever asked for out loud. He didn't cry the way he had on the phone. He cried the way men cry when they finally understand that forgiveness is not a receipt you get to sign. It's a blanket someone drapes over you while you're sleeping. When the house went still, I wrote one more line in the red notebook with a steadiness I did not borrow from anywhere. We're even. It wasn't revenge, it was balance. That night, the kettle sang itself to sleep on the stove while the city turned its face toward another morning. I lay down with my window open to the sound of cicadas, to the breath of a street that had carried me to and from bus stops, to and from Mercy, for 30 years. I thought of the ring in its box, the fence no longer leaning, the door that could open without shrieking. I thought of my boy on the couch, long and quiet, a man again because he finally learned how to be a son. I went the way a candle goes when you cup your hand around it and whisper thanks. In the morning, the porch didn't look empty. It looked ready. Mrs. Miller brought flowers the color of butter and said the hymn's soft, because that's how you talk to houses that have just learned a new silence. Thomas stood by the gate with his hat off, grief sitting on his shoulder like a patient bird. He didn't say a word to anyone, but he went to the kitchen and turned off the kettle before it could cry. Ethan found the red notebook on the table, the last line, waiting like a door I had left him open. He pressed it to his chest. Later, he would read it aloud when the world needed a scripture that hadn't come from a church. Later, he would carry it to rooms full of children who had learned the cost of dreams too early and teach them how to count what mattered without letting anyone steal the sum. Later, he would nail a small plaque near a doorway that said, "For every woman who gave her last dollar and still smiled," and the building would know its name. But that morning, he did what boys do when men leave the room. He washed the cup I hadn't finished. He made the bed I had left warm. He opened the window over the sink and let the jacaranda petals gather on the sill like tiny handkerchiefs. He sat at the table and took out a pen. His handwriting had grown since the year he wrote thank you notes I had forced him to mail. He flipped to a blank page, the first blank he had allowed himself in years, and wrote a sentence that belonged to both of us. Her justice became my peace. He stopped there, because sometimes you don't add the second sentence until you're sure you can live it. The rest belongs to time, and time, unlike people, does not hurry. The investigation did what investigations do. The law remembered how to stand up. The women who built their thrones from the wrong wood found out how easily fire travels. And my son learned something that no sermon had managed to teach him. Forgiveness is not the opposite of consequence. It is the soil where consequence plants its lesson, and where love, stubborn as a weed, grows back through concrete. On the porch, the rocker kept its rhythm. The door eased open without complaint. The fence held. The ring shone in its box beneath a slant of afternoon sun. And in the mirror over the bathroom sink, if you looked past the chalk words and the small river of hair that I hadn't swept entirely, you could almost see a woman laughing like she had finally put down what was never hers to carry. They buried me under the jacaranda tree that summer. The one that dropped purple petals like mercy. The morning was kind, not cruel, just bright enough to show the dust on everyone's shoes. I know because Ethan told me later how the light looked when he carried the notebook to the grave. He said it felt like the world was bowing without ceremony. After everyone left, he stayed. Sat there long after the preacher's words stopped echoing. He told me things I'd already forgiven him for, and things I hadn't heard yet. He said the silence felt full, not empty. That's when I knew I'd done enough. For months he lived in that small house the way you live inside an apology. Careful, reverent, afraid to touch too much. The neighbors brought casseroles he didn't eat. He kept my ring on the kitchen shelf where sunlight hit it at 4 every afternoon. He started sorting through the bills, the notebooks, the old receipts, and somewhere in that slow dust he found direction. He didn't go back to Rome. Didn't go back to business. Instead, he went down to a church basement on Avalon Avenue where volunteers taught kids how to read bank statements. He offered to help. At first, they didn't recognize the man in the suit that didn't quite fit, the hands that trembled when they touched a calculator. But then he began to speak, not like a teacher, but like someone remembering his own lesson. He taught them about the cost of small lies, about signatures that carry weight, about how money isn't freedom if it's stolen peace. The kids listened. Maybe they didn't understand all the words, but they understood the tone. Pain makes a language of its own. Months passed, and he saved enough to turn the basement into a real classroom. The sign outside said, The Miriam House. He didn't pick the name, the community did. They said it sounded like hope. He hung my red notebook in a frame by the entrance, open to the page that read, "We're even." People asked what it meant. He said, "Balance." And then he'd smile in that small, careful way that keeps you from breaking. Every week, he added new pages to his own notebook, blue cover, silver spine. "For justice became my peace," he wrote on the first page. Beneath it, her silence became my voice. Years folded into years. The city changed its skin, new buildings, new faces, but the Miriam house stayed the same color as forgiveness. Kids grew up, came back with their own children, pointed at the framed photo of a woman with cropped hair and a half smile, and said, "That's who started it." Ethan aged quietly. The mirror softened him, the way time softens anything that refuses to stay angry. Gray hair, steady eyes, slower steps. But his hands, the ones that once signed away everything, built shelves, fixed windows, wrote letters for families who couldn't write their own. He never remarried, said he was already partnered with purpose. One spring morning, a young woman showed up at his office door, thin, nervous, clutching a folder like it might explode. Her name tag said Danielle Nguyen, intern. "Mr. Hart?" she asked. "I was sorting old files and found this." She handed him an envelope the color of old paper, his name written on it in handwriting that stopped his breath. He knew the curve of that E before the rest came into focus. He opened it with fingers that still trembled when mercy came too close. Inside was a single page, thin enough to see through. "Ethan, if you're reading this, it means you finally learned what silence can build. The world doesn't need perfect men, baby. It needs men who fall and still find their way home. When you forgive yourself, you forgive me too. Mom." He read it until the ink blurred and the room began to hum. Danielle asked, "Was that from your mother?" And he nodded without words. "She'd be proud," she whispered. "She already was," he said. That night, he left the office later than usual. The city glowed like melted gold. He walked the long way back to Avalon Avenue, past the mural of the jacaranda tree someone had painted years ago. The old house still stood. Someone had painted it white, but the bones were still mine. He sat on the porch steps, closed his eyes, and listened. For a moment, he could smell coffee. Black, bitter, mine. A week later, when he didn't come to work, they found him in his chair by the window, peaceful, notebook in hand. The last line he'd written read, "Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving." The staff buried him beside me under the jacaranda tree. The roots had grown deep. The petals still fell like small blessings. Danielle took over the foundation. She was 24 then, heart too big for her chest, voice soft but certain. She framed his blue notebook beside my red one and wrote a plaque beneath. "Miriam taught justice. Ethan taught peace. We teach love that lasts." When the foundation turned 20, the mayor came, cameras flashed, and the air filled with applause that felt like rain on a dry roof. Danielle gave a speech, said, "They built light out of loss, and we're just here to keep it burning." Later that night, when everyone was gone, she sat alone on the porch bench, yes, the same one Ethan rebuilt after my death, and opened her own small journal. She wrote, "Their voices became my light." The wind shifted. The jacaranda tree dropped petals into her lap. She looked up and smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. 40 years later, the foundation still stood. The walls carried laughter, the halls carried stories, and the plaque by the entrance gleamed. Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving. Children came, learned, left, came again. Mothers sat in chairs that once held grief and found themselves lighter. Every night, the porch light stayed on. And sometimes, if you listened just right, when the jacaranda leaves brushed against the windows, you could almost hear two voices, one low, one calm, talking like old friends. "Keep the light on, baby," I say. "Always, Mom," he answers. And the wind carries our words into the city that once tried to break us, but ended up learning what love sounds like when it forgives itself. I was 24 when the keys to the Miriam house touched my palm and felt heavier than a building. They were small, ordinary, scratched in the places 1,000 hands had worried them, but they carried the weight of 2 lives, and a promise I did not make so much as inherit. The morning I opened the doors as director, the jacaranda tree outside had shaken itself loose in the night, scattering purple petals along the steps, like the city had been confettied by grief and hope at once. I swept the petals aside with the same care one might give to letters left on a grave, then stopped, realizing it was a good omen to leave some where they fell. People like me need signs even when we pretend we don't. Inside, the hallways kept the smell I had come to love: lemon polish and paper. The framed photo of Evelyn Hart watched the entry like a mother, deciding who is ready to learn and who merely wants to be seen learning. Beside her hung the glass case with 2 notebooks, one red, one blue. The red lay open to we're even, the blue open too. Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving. People asked whether those pages ever changed, as if words could grow new meanings without moving. I learned soon enough that meaning does move, but only inside you. There are days a place like this hums like a good beehive, and there are days it is only a room waiting to be told what to be. The first weeks felt like both. I drank coffee from a mug that had belonged to Ethan, thin-lipped, chipped along the handle, and met with neighbors who spoke in careful sentences about what they needed. A budgeting class at hours that made sense for night shift workers, a child watch for the women who could not afford to learn without somewhere safe to put their babies, a way to talk to banks that stopped conversations at the first accent. My job, I learned, was part architect and part translator and part broom. Mostly broom. On my second Friday, a boy hovered in the doorway as if he had been poured there and dried without permission to cross the threshold. He was maybe 12, wearing a backpack that had never been new even on the day it was handed down to him. I asked his name like you ask a bird to land. "Marcus," he said, and then his eyes jumped to the glass case. "Were they real?" I told him they had been as real as the kind of light that keeps burning when you forget to pay the electric bill. He didn't laugh. He pointed at the red notebook. Did she forgive him because she was dying? The question cracked the air like ice under an early step. I said, I think she forgave him because she wanted to live. And then let that hang between us like a shared coat on a rainy afternoon. You do not realize how quickly a calendar fills until there are more people than chairs. We added sessions and then added more, borrowed tables from a church down the block, learned the names of every janitor in a 3-mile radius. At night, I locked up alone and sat on the porch bench Ethan had rebuilt the year he learned how to say sorry without words, and I watched the porch light the way some people watch the moon. It was a small square of steady glow in a city that flickered. Sometimes I swore I could hear voices, one low and amused, one steady and sure, carried in the late air like radio from a house down the street. "Keep the light on, baby," I'd hear. "Always, Mom," I'd answer, and only realize later that my mouth had moved. We grew, not like a firework, but like a vine that has decided it will outlive the fence. A retired teacher named Mrs. Carter took over life math on Wednesdays and made compound interest feel like a story with a trick ending you could still win if you read carefully. A banker with a decent soul and a complicated job offered office hours where he practiced the language of mercy without losing his employment. A mechanic, hands nicked and honest, taught Car Bills 101, explaining why engines fail like marriages and how to hear the difference between a belt that squeals and a salesman who does. We hung a bell by the front desk. Ring when you paid off a debt. Ring when you landed a job. Ring when your sister left him. Ring when you remembered your worth. But growing has a price printed in fine, invisible ink. One afternoon, a councilman came to tour the center with a smile too polished for the neighborhood. He liked our stories. He liked them the way someone likes an echo of his own voice. He offered funding with a handshake that felt like a test. I read the grant contract 3 times and then took it home like a stray dog I already knew I couldn't keep. Page 6, paragraph 3. Advisory oversight, messaging approvals, photo rights. We tell our stories, he said on the phone, so the city understands why you matter. I told him the city would understand because our lights were on when theirs weren't. He paused, long enough to make me hear my own heartbeat, then said, "We'll be in touch." We were, but not the way he meant. That night I went to the old house on Avalon Avenue. The porch had been painted since Ethan's time, but the wood still knew where to creak like a familiar joke. I sat on the steps and wrote in my own notebook, green cover because it was the only one left at the pharmacy. I wrote, "We do not sell our wounds for airtime. if the city wants a miracle, it can come sit on this bench and watch the light work. Then I tore the page out and tucked it under the doormat for the future version of me who would doubt her spine. People talk about courage like it is a roar. Sometimes it is a footnote you leave yourself before sleep. The next test came with a petition. Someone had decided our night classes made the block too loud. Here is the sound of people learning after work. Laughter that remembers how, children with crayons to spare, a bell that rings because a debt has been paid with coins that looked like breath minutes earlier. We moved the bell to the hallway, gave out crayons that broke more quietly, gave our laughter another room, and let it find us again. You learn, in a place like this, to bend without breaking, and to break only when the light needs more room. I kept returning to the notebooks. Some evenings I would unlock the case and read a page like a song. I was not stealing. I was borrowing steadiness and returning it with interest. We're even, she had written. I thought about what even means when one life has built a bridge out of another's bones. Then I turned to Ethan's last line and traced it with a finger, the glass cool under my skin. Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving. I rolled that sentence around my mouth like a sacrament. We handed out copies of it on a card you could tuck in a wallet for the kind of day that shakes your edges loose. The first scandal, and every good work earns at least one, came in our 8th year. A donor who had introduced herself as a storyteller turned out to be a collector of pain. She took a photo of a mother on our porch, captioned it with a lie, and turned it into art that sold for a price the mother would never touch. The mother's name was Rose. She cleaned offices at night and had 3 kids who knew how to be quiet without being told. The photo showed her laughing, head thrown back, a joy that belonged to a joke her daughter had just told about the neighbor's rooster that crowed at buses. The caption turned that laugh into survival porn. She has nothing. She still smiles. I found the storyteller. The next morning, asked her to return every cent, or we would return her name to the city with a letter she would not like framed. She returned the money. We returned it to Rose with the explanation Art had tried to borrow her soul without paying admission. Rose cried, then laughed, then used the money to fix the leak that had winter living in her kitchen ceiling. The rooster, for the record, continued to crow at buses. In our 12th year, Marcus, the boy who asked whether forgiveness was a symptom, came back as a man. I knew him by the way he looked at the glass case before he looked at me. He had lines near his eyes that belonged to smiling, and a shirt with a name patch, Marcus H. He had learned to fix air conditioners and cars, and the kind of machines porches become when nobody has thanked them in a while. He told me his mother had stopped loaning money she could not afford to lose, that he had opened a savings account and named it Tomorrow, that he still heard me say love gives and remembers whenever he wanted to be right instead of kind. He came on Tuesdays, taught a class called Tools. Half the course was about wrenches. The other half was about how not to talk yourself out of asking for help. A baby cried in our classroom once all the way through my lecture on predatory lending. I kept talking, as did mothers the world over, and afterward the young woman apologized for bringing the baby because she had no choice and assumed we would understand. We did. We gathered around her and passed the baby like you pass good news. The baby's hair smelled like the beginning of rain. I wrote in my notebook that night, "We do not build a house to keep out the crying. We build it so the crying has somewhere to finish." The award came in our 15th year, which is a year buildings count differently than people. It was a plaque from the city, a glass thing heavy enough to be a weapon against whatever had tried to break us. The mayor gave a speech, and cameras snapped a sound that feels like no sound and too much at once. I accepted with words I had practiced in the bathroom mirror, because mirrors are wise and do not clap at you when you are not ready. I said we were not heroes, we were neighbors. I said we studied the math of living together and learned to carry the remainder in the margins. I did not say what I wanted to say about budgets and lights that find a way to glow when the bill is overdue. Some truths prefer porches. After the ceremony, when the last handshake had cooled, I sat alone with the notebooks and told the room what I had not said. "They will forget," I whispered to the glass, "but we will not." The bell even moved to the hall, seemed to answer with its own small echo. I stood, turned off the lights, and left the porch light on, because that is our doctrine and our habit and our proof. There were losses that did not make speeches. Mrs. Carter died in the winter. Her laugh kept pretending it was not cold. We put her lesson plans in a binder titled The Good Explanations. The banker lost his job and then found a better one at a credit union that believed mercy belonged in the training manual. The mechanic moved to take care of his father and mailed us a socket set with a note. For the class that taught me talk isn't cheap if it helps you say the right thing. The councilman lost an election, and the city learned to clap without asking for rights to the applause. And there were arrivals. A girl named Joy who carried her name like a dare. A grandfather with a bow tie and a cane who wanted to know what all this internet was charging his grandchildren for. A woman with 2 jobs and a laugh like the bell we moved. She paid off a hospital bill, one envelope at a time, and rang a sound that rearranged the hallway's dust. In our 20th year, a news station asked to film a piece about the legacy. I said yes on a Thursday, and then said no in my sleep, woke with the taste of the wrong decision in my mouth, called them back and said we would speak without cameras. They sent a reporter with patient eyes and a notebook. We talked at a picnic table someone had painted too blue. I told her we weren't the legacy. The people were. She wrote that down without asking me to say it better. When the piece aired, it ended on the porch light and the jacaranda leaves that never stopped falling, as if the tree hung its own version of confetti for whoever needed to remember how to celebrate quietly. Once a year, on the day both of them died. 2 years apart, but somehow folded into one. I closed the center an hour early and walked to the cemetery where the jacaranda grows tall enough to shade 2 stones without asking which name deserves more. The groundskeeper nods like we have a secret between us and leaves me alone with the birds. I sit and read to them both. Sometimes it's a ledger because numbers are poems when they say we have enough. Sometimes it's a letter from a teenager who took life math and learned how to leave a boy who thought checks were promises you make with someone else's account. I tell them about the bell, about the baby who cried and then grew quiet and then drew a picture of a house with a heart for a door. I tell them about the nights the light flickers and I stand on a chair to change the bulb because miracles deserve maintenance. On the 25th spring, Marcus fixed the porch steps again, and I realized I had watched a boy become a man, and a man become a teacher, and a teacher become the kind of neighbor who is the reason the word neighbor still has any music in it. He asked if we would ever move to a bigger building. I said maybe, and felt the no underneath my tongue like a coin I was not yet ready to spend. Growth is not always forward. Sometimes it is deeper. The roots of the jacaranda taught me that. They know where to go. They do not ask permission from sidewalks. There was one last lesson waiting for me in a file I had never opened because I had not needed it until the morning I did. It was a letter, sealed, with my name in a hand I did not recognize until my stomach did. Thomas Gray had written it the year Ethan died. He must have known it would find me when my hands were a little steadier than my voice. I opened it at the desk by the window where afternoon light made paper look like a clean sheet of water. Diana, if this is in your hands, then what needed keeping has been kept, and what needed mending has remembered its seam. I am an old man now, and I know 2 things with certainty. Justice is slow and love is slower, but both arrive if you leave the door unlocked. I watched Evelyn choose the hard grace. I watched Ethan learn the soft courage. It is your turn to teach the long patience. Keep the porch light on, not for them, for yourself, so you can see the steps when you are carrying something heavy home. Thomas, I folded the letter and felt the kind of cry that never reaches the eyes, because it is born somewhere in the throat where gratitude lives. I placed the letter in the glass case for one day, then took it out again, because not everything belongs in a museum. Some things belong in the pocket of the person who needs to feel them. The last test of those years arrived not as a scandal, or a petition, or a contract, but as a storm that knocked out power for 3 nights across half the city. The streets were flashlights and candles, and the weak glow of phones not ready to die. I came to the porch with a box of cheap tea lights and enough matches to light a choir. The center filled the way churches do when the ground shakes. Mothers sat where they could lay toddlers across their laps. Men who had never asked for anything before asked for a blanket and a place to sit where the old ache in their knees could rest. We made peanut butter sandwiches and called them dinner without apology. Someone brought a guitar, and someone else reminded us hymns don't require religion to work. The porch light, fed by the generator we bought after the last storm, burned like a star that had decided to stay low for once, where hands could warm themselves on it. A boy, no older than Marcus had been, no younger than the hour, stood beside me and asked whether the light could run out. "Everything runs out," I said, and then touched the top of his head. "But we take turns being the battery." On the third night, when the power surged back and the city remembered itself with a startled hum, I unlocked the glass case and turned both notebooks to new pages. In Evelyn's, I slipped a card with a sentence of hers I had copied 100 times. "Justice doesn't scream. It waits." In Ethan's, I slid Thomas's letter, folded once, like a bridge the size of a hand. People came and pressed their palms to the glass and did not ask for more. The room was very quiet, which is one way you know a place is full. I am older now than 24. The mirror has learned the names of every line near my eyes. The porch bench remembers my shape the way water remembers its favorite stones. There are new faces behind the front desk and in the classroom and at the bell and on the steps, the kind of faces that tell you a city is holding on. When I lock up at night, I say goodnight to the photos and to the empty rooms and to the broom because it has done more for dignity than most speeches. I leave the light on and walk the long way home so I can pass the tree and listen to the leaves invent a language of their own. Sometimes people ask me what I think legacy means. I tell them it is not the building, though buildings matter. It is not the plaque, though plaques shine bravely. It is not even the notebooks, though paper has kept strangers alive longer than medicine. Legacy is the quiet that comes after the light has done its job, when the person who needed the door finds it and steps through and does not look back except to hold it a moment for the next. Tonight, as I sit on the porch and the city becomes a softer version of itself, I think of a woman who wrote Strength, were even in a red notebook and taught a boy that forgiveness is not the opposite of justice, but the place where justice learns how to keep breathing. I think of a man who wrote that forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving, and then left it. I think of a letter from a lawyer who knew more about patience than his suits suggested. I think of a bell that rings quietly in the hall where nobody can complain anymore that joy is too loud. A breeze moves through the jacaranda and the petals drift down, a small storm of purple that lands on the steps and does not ask to be swept. In the hush between cars, I hear it again, the radio of the old world tuned to the right station. "Keep the light on, baby." "Always, Mom." I smile because the call is not only theirs anymore. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood on this porch and learned the arithmetic of enough. I lock the door, I leave the light. I walk down the steps slowly because you should always leave a place the way you want to find it again, with time, with care, with the path still visible. A boy, Marcus's son, though not only his, waves from across the street and shouts that he rang the bell today. I shout back that I heard it from the office, and it was the best sound the building learned all week. At the corner, I turn and look back the way you look back at your own name. The light holds steady against the dark, like a lesson that never learned how to end. A city hums, a tree drops its quiet applause, and somewhere in the room where the notebooks rest, the air remembers how to listen. I tuck the keys deeper into my pocket, their weight exactly right, and whisper a promise into the part of the night that collects promises and sorts them carefully. As long as there are doors, we will hold them open. As long as there is darkness, we will keep something lit. As long as there is dead of the heart, we will teach the math that balances it without breaking it. Then, because it is late and the world asks you to finish your sentences, I go home. The light does not follow me. It stays where it belongs, pouring itself onto the steps for whoever needs to see the way. I was older by the time I learned how quiet a building can be when it knows it has done its work. The Miriam house had taken on the sound of breath, steady, present, not eager to prove itself anymore. Morning light entered the foyer and laid itself over the glass case with the 2 notebooks like a blessing the city had finally remembered how to give. The red still open to, we're even. The blue still open to. Forgiveness is the only inheritance worth leaving. Some days I forgot the glass and touched the words with my eyes alone. Some days I remembered the glass and touched the memories with my hands in my pockets, the way you touch grief you've made peace with. Time rearranged the walls without moving them. Photographs multiplied the way families do when the table keeps making room. A row of frames near the front desk showed faces at bells and doors and picnic tables. A collage of before and after smiles that made the entry feel like a hymn. New paint found the places old paint had let go. The porch bench learned my shape so well that I could sit with my eyes closed and find the same board with the same knot in the wood every evening, as if the bench had decided it would keep my place when I was not there to keep it myself. I kept my rituals. Unlock, lights, a slow walk through the classrooms to say good morning to chairs and windows and the quiet that waited to become conversation. I greeted the broom in the closet with a pat to the handle and a sentence only a broom would understand. You do the work nobody writes plaques for. If I was the keeper of the light, the broom was the keeper of dignity. It knew where corners hoarded dust the way hearts hoard unspent kindness. We had grown beyond one address by then. Not like a chain, which is a word that forgets trees. We grew like jacarandas, rooted, then repeated. Branches holding their own small skies in neighborhoods that needed shade. There was a Miriam house on the east side, one across the river, one where the freeway split a commune. The community built a bridge anyway. The porch lights matched. Same warm bulb, same glass hood, same habit of being left on for whoever needed a door at the end of a hard street. I visited each like a grandmother who knows which grandchild will pretend not to need a hug until the hug arrives. But my home was the first porch. I measured my seasons in petals and bells, and the way late sun performed a familiar miracle on the floorboards. I was not in a hurry. The years had taught me to love the slow mathematics of change. Add trust, subtract shame, carry one another. The letter from Thomas Gray lived in my desk drawer, folded along one clean seam, a bridge you could slip into a pocket. I read it when meetings tasted like chalk and when papers tried to convince me that stories belonged to signatures. Keep the porch light on, he had written, not for them, for yourself, so you can see the steps when you are carrying something heavy home. There are sentences that become railings. That one kept me from falling more times than I could count. The crisis that came in those last years did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It came on official paper with a font that looked like it had been ironed and rules that sounded like compliments until you reached the part where the compliments were a leash. Consolidation, the letter said. Alignment. Efficiency. They wanted our lights on, just not our stories without their permission. They offered funding with a map that moved our doors to corners I did not trust. Away from bus stops, nearer to offices with windows that watched the block like it needed a reason to be forgiven. They spoke about metrics. They spoke about scale. They said legacy as if legacy were a grant category instead of a way of walking. I took the letter to the bench and read it with the kind of calm you teach yourself when you realize you are the adult in the room that used to be your childhood. Around me, late afternoon turned the street to honey and traffic to a patient animal. A little boy wobbling on a too-big bike called out, "Miss Diana, you see me?" And I called back, "I see you." Because sometimes the right sentence is only 2 words long. Then I raised the letter to the light and watched it become a little more transparent. Paper always tells the truth if you hold it to the sun. That evening I unlocked the glass case and took out both notebooks. I placed them side by side on the desk, red to the left, blue to the right, the way we had kept them, like one hand ready to hold the other. I tore a page from my green notebook, the one I started as an intern when I still learned faith, the way you learn a new city, with a finger on the map and a willingness to get lost. And I wrote, slowly, in the largest letters my wrist could shape. We do not sell our light to fund our light. Then, because stubbornness can be a virtue if you marry it to love, I wrote another line below it. We asked the neighborhood that needed this porch to build it with us again. It is a particular courage, the courage of asking. Asking without apology. Asking without pride. Asking like you have already decided the answer will be a new kind of yes, even if it looks like a no. The next day, we set a table on the porch with a jar and a ledger and a cardboard sign that said, "Porches are commons. Add what you can." The jar filled so slowly at first that I had to teach myself not to stare at it like a patient you're trying to heal with your eyes. Then the jar filled all at once the way rain does when it remembers what clouds are for. A woman left $5 and the first smooth laughter she had dared that week. A teenager delivered a crumpled envelope containing 8 ones and a note that said, "I owe you for the day you told me leaving isn't quitting." A barber brought a folded bill and said he'd come monthly, whether our sign asked him to or not. A landlord, we had more than one who needed redeeming, gave 3 months rent relief to a family and insisted we put the money we would have collected into the jar, for the ledger, for the bell. Not all stories ask for initials carved in the table. Some stories are content to be a weight that keeps the jar from tipping in the wind. The city blinked at us with its tired eyes and realized we were not bargaining. We were building. We were also stubborn as the roots that lift sidewalks without meaning to. In the end, the letter's promise of leash money folded into somebody else's office, and we kept our doors where our feet had learned them. The lights the same wattage as the first day we screwed the bulb in and whispered, "Let there be a way home." The last class I taught was life math Tuesday night, spring leaning towards summer, the room full of faces I had met before and faces that were about to teach me new names. We wrote on the board a small equation that had carried us through hurricanes you cannot see on the news. Paycheck minus rent, minus groceries, minus bus pass, minus what you give away too easily, plus what you decide you are worth, equals breathing room. The breathing room is where choices fit. We talked interest rates and balance transfers and how to tell the difference between a sale and a seduction. We passed around a stack of letters from banks, the kind that begin "Dear valued customer" and end in a trap, so they would know the smell of a lie when it arrived. Someone's baby cried. We made space. A young man at the back asked if forgiveness also had an interest rate. His question arrived and sat down beside me like a friend. I said forgiveness has a cost and a return, and they arrive on different days. Then I told him something Evelyn taught me without ever laying a hand on my shoulder. Forgiveness is not a coupon. It is a key. After class, I lingered the way teachers do when they don't want to admit the hallways are waiting to empty. Marcus, older now, shoulders broader than his smile, a man who had learned to carry joy like a toolbox, tightened a hinge without being asked. He had a son now, a bright, serious boy named Daniel who pronounced every syllable of everything like language had finally become a fair trade. Daniel pushed the bell with an index finger and looked to me for permission to let it ring. I nodded. The sound went down the hallway and hung there, a small chandelier of hope. And I thought, how many more times will I hear that and know it like my own name? A reporter came to ask about the expansion we had not intended but somehow were inviting. She was young, hair folded into a bun the way you fold a letter you plan to keep. She said her grandmother used to clean houses on this block, and she herself had learned to translate bills before she learned to translate poetry. She asked about legacy, and I made a motion with my hand like I was smoothing the air. Legacy is a porch light left on and a broom leaning where anyone can reach it, I said. Legacy is a ledger with more names in the carried by column than the carrying column. Legacy is not a museum, it's a practice. She cried, not because the words were perfect, but because they were the words she needed to have heard from someone before she had to invent them herself. When the city gave us the day, the proclamation kind of day, with a name that embarrasses the people who actually did the work, we accepted without pretending we didn't like being seen. Then, we turned the microphone toward the crowd and let stories choose their own narrators. A child read a poem about credit scores and cupcakes. A grandmother spoke of a checking account opened at 68 and the way the teller smiled without condescension for the first time in her memory. A man who once sat with his head in his hands during every Tuesday session lifted those hands and signed to the crowd without a voice. "Thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on sentences." Night edged in. The jacaranda began to shed its small sky onto our shoulders. I thought of the first time I swept those petals aside and then stopped, because some things are meant to be walked through. The porch light snapped on as if cued by the story itself. I felt the moment settle on my bones. The building knew how to keep breathing without me telling it when to inhale. I do not want to romanticize leaving. Leaving is work. It requires inventories and phone calls and the kind of meetings that ask for an agenda and deliver confession. It asks your hands to remember what they have held so they know how to let go without dropping anything. It asks your heart to step out onto a step it cannot see and trust the next step is already reaching up to meet it. I made a list of people who could carry the keys, then drew a circle around one name, and then for good measure, drew it again. Her name was Grace Porter. She had once brought us a story folded into fear and learned to unfold the fear into a map. She had a laugh that could find a corner and make the corner rethink its job. She had a way with forms that made forms feel like allies. She was the kind of neighbor who knows when you need soup and when you need silence. I asked Grace to walk with me after closing. We traced the rooms like two women, making sure a sleeping house had tucked itself in properly. In the classroom, I showed her the chalk that wrote clean and the chalk that wrote brave. In the supply closet, I introduced her to the broom and told her its true title. In the office, I placed Thomas's letter on the desk and said, "Read this when the city speaks in fonts. He will remind you that porches do not need permission to be porches." On the porch, I taught her the switch that sometimes stuck and the way to jiggle it with kindness, because everything opens easier when it is spoken to gently. At the bench, I told her about the knot in the wood that knew my name. And then I said the sentence I had been holding behind my teeth the way you hold a last bite for the perfect moment. "Grace, it's your turn to keep the light." She did not gasp. She did not refuse from modesty. She stood under the light, let it find her eyes, and nodded once, the kind of nod you learn from women who do not audition to be brave. They report for duty. "I won't let it go out," she said, and something in the tree above us sounded like applause you could only hear if you had been listening to that tree for 20 years. The homecoming I had avoided making into a ceremony arrived on a Tuesday morning when the street smelled like bread from a bakery that no longer existed. I unlocked, walked through, touched the frames, whispered to the rooms, thanked the broom, and felt the kind of gratitude that chases its own tail and never gets tired. I took the notebooks from the case and placed them both on the table, side by side, as always, red to the left, blue to the right. Then I opened my green one to a blank page, the rarest resource in a life like mine, and wrote in a hand that surprised me with its steadiness. "Keep the light on, baby." "Always, Mom." I did not sign it. I did not need to. I slipped the page into the case beneath the red book, a leaf on a river that already knew which way to travel. That night, we held no ceremony, because ceremonies can frighten the shy magic that does real work. We simply stayed late, let people ring the bell if they felt like it, poured lemonade into paper cups that collapsed pleasantly in your hand when you were done. Marcus told a story about a Thursday when the alternator died, and a neighbor named Frank who drove him to the shop and back 3 times, and how between them they learned the math of suddenly and the grace of anyway. Grace Porter stood at the porch and listened, like listening was a profession. Children lay on the warm boards and connected the first timid stars with fingers as if they were teaching the sky to spell its own name slowly. I could feel my leaving the way you feel weather change in your knees. Not pain, information. I had no plan to stop walking past this door. I had only a plan to walk not as the keeper, but as the kept. Kept by the lights I could still see from my corner. Kept by the voices I could hear from the grocery aisle when a parent taught a child to count change. Kept by the scent of lemon and paper that clung to my sweater like proof that my days had been well used. When the porch thinned and the night decided to lean against our railing like a friend who knows she is welcome to stay, I stood by Grace and showed her where the key likes to catch in the lock, and how to wiggle it with patience. The lock only argues when it's tired, I said, like people. She laughed, which meant she had already understood the part of the sentence I hadn't said aloud. We turned to leave at the same time and nearly collided with a girl on the bottom step. She wore a backpack that had learned every letter in the alphabet and a face that said she had practiced courage in a mirror. She looked up hopefully and then, hearing her own voice for the first time, asked, "Is it too late?" Grace answered the way a porch light would answer if it had a mouth. "Not if you're here," she said, and reached to hold the door. The girl stepped into the foyer and stopped in front of the glass case with the notebooks. She leaned toward the words, the way people lean toward a secret. "Are those real?" she asked. "They're more than real," Grace said. "They're how we learn to do this without losing ourselves." The girl nodded like someone who had already lost something and was relieved to discover it might be found again. I made my goodbye then, not the kind where you break a room with your feelings, but the kind where you kiss your fingers and touch the doorframe and trust wood to understand. I walked down the steps slowly, my knees translating the motion into small prayers of thanks for still knowing how. The jacaranda leaves brushed the air above my head and said what they had been saying since I was 24. Everything falls and everything grows. At the corner I turned to look back, the way you check the stove before you leave, not because you doubt, but because reverence is a habit. The porch light held a circle of gold like a small moon that had decided gravity could be negotiated. Through the glass I could see the girl's face lit by the words, and Grace's hand pointing not at the rules but at the chairs. "Sit," the gesture said. "Begin." Outside a boy pedaled past and shouted, "Miss Diana, you see me?" I raised my hand like a lighthouse and called back, "I see you," and felt how the sentence had become a benediction. I do not know if there is a heaven that looks like this block, or a room where a red notebook opens to a page that reads, "We're even," and a blue notebook opens to a line about inheritance, and all of it is a light you can step into without needing to close your eyes first. I only know that some nights, when the air behaves and the city remembers to be tender, the radio between worlds tunes itself and I hear a woman's soft laugh braided with a man's calm voice, a duet nobody taught and everyone recognizes. "Keep the light on, baby," she says. "Always, Mom," he answers. I smile, a small thing anyone driving by would miss, and go home by the long route because the long route lets you say goodnight properly. I count the porches that glow, and the windows that promise mornings, and the people who still wave when a day has been kind enough to leave them standing. At my door I fumble with the key and laugh at myself for having spent so many years teaching locks to open and still needing to remember the little twist at the end. Inside, my rooms hold their breath and then recognize me. I turn on one lamp and then another, because one lamp is a courtesy and two is a welcome. I put my keys in a bowl that has learned the weight of my leaving and the lighter weight of my returning. I sit, finally, and let the day unclasp itself from my shoulders. Out the window, far enough to be a star, close enough to be a promise, the Miriam house keeps its small sunlit. I do not own it. I am owned by it. I am owned by every yes that built it, every no that protected it, every maybe that became a therefore. The night deepens, the city hums, the tree outside writes in its fluent leaves. Somewhere, a bell rings, and somewhere a child sleeps in a house where the numbers add up to breathing room. And somewhere a mother opens a notebook and writes the sentence she didn't know she was brave enough to write. The light is not mine, not yours, not theirs. It is ours, in the old sense of the word, where our means everyone with a pulse and a pocket of need. I close my eyes, but not to end the day, only to listen to it finish itself. Love does not have an off switch. It only has a dimmer. And some nights, by grace or habit, or the stubbornness of people who refuse to stop helping one another, the hand on that dimmer turns the light all the way up and leaves it there as if to say, "See, we made a way." And because I have always preferred sentences that keep walking after the period, I whisper one more before sleep takes my hand. We will.